Constitution, so it's not answered in the Constitution.
You got it?
The only answer is it's up to the states.
And so,
Sorry, technical difficulty.
to me,
Call the Planning and Zoning Commission to order. Roll call.
Roger Froman,
Sean Cuff.
Chuck Smallwood.
Sylvia Henry.
Catherine Nyberger.
Sam Solars. Steve Gritman.
Jessica Bonniwell.
You could all stand for the Pledge of Allegiance,
I'm
please.
not getting up, Chuck, I'm sorry.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay. Look for an approval of the agenda.
Can I vote on that?
yeah,
I can vote on that, right? I make a motion to approve the agenda.
I have
I'll
a
second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Approval of the minutes from the April 10th, 2024 Planning and Zoning Commission meeting.
I didn't attend the meeting, so
Sylvia, you gonna get this one, or?
she didn't attend either.
I didn't
Motion to
either.
approve the minutes from the previous meeting.
Right.
I'll second it then.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? No old business?
I don't think we're supposed to vote on things that we weren't at.
Oh, I got what you're saying.
Okay. No old business, new business. We have a new member application from George Schaust, who's in the audience. George, if you could just come up to the podium and introduce yourself. Yep.
Microphone should be on.
I'm George Schaust. I've moved to Montrose from out on 25, about halfway between Montrose and Watertown 11 years ago. I've background is a lot of automotive. I was the Saturn service manager for their lifetime and other things in the auto industry. I did some other things after Saturn closed down. I also do some real estate, do some Homes for Heroes things where I help out heroes as far as some compensation of my commissions when they buy a home through that program. I do have a few rental properties, and I guess Chuck kind of asked me if I'd be interested, and I'm here to learn a little bit and see how things look and go from there.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody have any questions for George?
It's nice to meet you.
Brent?
Welcome.
Okay. All right. Thank you, George.
fantastic.
Okay. I'd be looking for a motion then to move to accept George onto planning and zoning.
I want to know who's quitting.
No one.
Well, then
have
how would we
7.
have an opening?
We're allowed to have 7 people. We just haven't had any applicants since.
Right.
Okay.
Since the 50s.
So it's an odd number, so having 7 is great.
I'll make a motion to approve George Fouch.
I'll second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, passes 5-0. We'll move this on to City Council for their approval at their next meeting. And hope to see you here next month.
Yep.
All right, next is the cannabis business regulations. I'll turn this one over to Mr. Gritman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commission. In front of you is a draft ordinance that would establish business regulations for cannabis businesses and a cover memo that kind of works through some of the material, and I'll spend a few minutes here just kind of introducing this, give you some additional background, As I'm sure you're all aware, the legislature in 2023 approved a whole series of cannabis-related statutory language. Some of that related to personal use and possession, and some of it related to business activity for cannabis. The personal use stuff took effect last year, and as of January 2025, the business regulations, or the business licensing, is scheduled to go into effect. And the legislation established a new state department called the Office of Cannabis Management. And that office was charged with creating rules and other guidelines around the potential licensing of cannabis businesses in Minnesota. And they are currently working through the mandate that the legislature gave them. Just within the last maybe couple of months, they developed a model ordinance for local communities to use as a guideline if you're inclined to do so, and we'll talk about the contents of that ordinance a little bit tonight too. This is a discussion item tonight. Well, we need to at some point move through to adopt some ordinances, and the plan here is to have a public hearing at your October meeting on this item, and then send it on to council. We need to have things in place before the end of the year, just for a little context. When the state adopted their legislation, the state kept a lot of the rules and authority to themselves. The Office of Cannabis Management sets up the rulemaking around cannabis businesses. They are responsible for licensing potential cannabis business applicants. The cities have some role in this, primarily land use zoning. So in a very generalized manner, the way this might work is a person might apply to the state to operate a cannabis business, and there are several kinds. We'll talk a little bit about that too. They might apply to the state for a license. The state will do some initial vetting on the candidate, and then they will ask the city whether or not the proposed location for this business person meets your zoning rules. And basically the city has a kind of a yay or nay role on that aspect of it. And then through the county, in most cases in Wright County, will rely on the county to do most of the response and registration, and then the law enforcement side of that. So it's a relatively limited role for local government, and particularly since the county is the law enforcement agency for Montrose, most of that will be relating to administrative tasks of ensuring that a proposed licensed location is properly zoned. There are a few other things to it, but that's really the ordinance, or the statute is long, but a lot of it narrows down to that essential role for the city. We are not permitted to zone our community in a way where cannabis businesses are not allowed. We can't create a zoning ordinance that would have that effect. We're required, every city is required, to have at least one, or make available one eligible license business for retail purposes for every 12,500 population. So for Montrose, that means one, until the city grows manyfold, and then eventually you may hit the second license requirement. You're permitted to allow more than one if you choose to. So basically, it's up to the city to decide how many licenses you would be willing to accept, but the minimum is one for communities of our size. There are a few things around the business aspect of things that we can do. First of all, there's to think about cannabis businesses generally. There are industrial-oriented businesses that some of it is growing, production, processing, packaging, transportation, those kinds of business or operations. And then there are operations that are more retail oriented, where they would sell processed goods to the general public. And there's a couple of hybrid licenses. The statute refers to them as micro business and meso business. So if you've read through any of the material, those are businesses that have a production side, but also want to sell some of their production to in a retail way to customers on site. So you might think of it as kind of like a brew pub that sells growlers. They brew beer, but they'll also sell a growler for somebody to take their beer off site and consume the microbrew at home. So that's the idea of micro and meso businesses. The only difference between those two is really the size of the operation. So there's a threshold square footage for the building in the statute. You are not required to allow, so typical micro or meso business might be somebody buys raw product, packages it on site, and then wants to sell it out the front door. So they have a packaging aspect and industrial use, but they also want to retail it. You're not required that packaging business would be in an industrial use. You'd be located in your industrial zone. You're not required to allow them to also retail out of that. So you don't have to allow micro or meso businesses in your community if you don't want to. But it's just kind of this hybrid business activity that the state established as one of its potential licensees. The one license I was talking about relates to anybody who's doing retail. So you're required to allow at least one of these businesses to do retail. Beyond that, we don't have a whole lot to say about other license applicants. If they're just a manufacturer or something like that, and we have industrial property, the presumption is they would be allowed to do their industrial activity in the industrial district like any other industrial business. So that's a little bit about kind of the overview of the licensing. Like I said, we're required to tell the state we'll allow just at least one. We have some choices if we want to allow more than that, obviously. The county also has a role here because the state said one for every 12,500 residents in each city, but the county has some ability to say, well, aggregately, on Wright County population, we would only be required to issue 15 retail licenses. So there's some discussion at the county level about whether or not the county will permit individual cities to approve licenses or registrations beyond the county's max of 15. The county can do that, so that's part of what the county is working on through a joint powers agreement with the local communities that they provide law enforcement to, Montrose being one of those. So that discussion is kind of still ongoing. The county is working on their joint powers agreement. The cities are talking about how to go about joining that agreement, that consortium, if you will. Most of the cities with their own police forces are not part of the joint powers agreements. They do their own policing. So Buffalo, Howard Lake, Annandale. Is that it?
Cokato.
Cokato. That do their own policing would basically be on their own outside of the county's licensing. That's kind of a minor issue. The county sounds like they're going to be flexible about what the cities want, but just a kind of a side issue for our discussion. As the memo talks about and as the ordinance kind of works through, there are a handful of areas that we have some discretion. Like I said, the number of licenses is one of those. The second is whether or not we would require somebody to go through a re-registration process if they wanted to move. So if we had a local business that was properly zoned, properly operating, but let's say that their lease was running out, they wanted to move down the street to another appropriate location, are we going to require them to come back and get a new license registration or not? The statute allows us to require that. It's really a tracking mechanism, but truthfully, if they meet our code and they're the one, we don't have whole lot to say about it, not a lot of discretion, given the way the statute's written, but it is an area that we can regulate in. Probably the biggest one that will affect our zoning discussions is buffer zones from certain youth-oriented, primarily youth-oriented business organizations. The statute allows you to place a buffer zone around schools of up to 1,000 feet for no cannabis businesses within that zone, up to 500 feet from daycares or parks with child-oriented facilities, or 500 feet from residential substance abuse treatment facilities too. You can create those buffers. The problem with the buffering is that if you establish the state maximum and you looked at your map and you found out that it wipes out all of the commercial industrial areas in the city, we've gone afoul of the statute. So we have to fine tune our buffering a little bit, assuming that you're interested in doing some buffering. We have to fine tune that a little bit to make sure we don't zone out everything in the city, because the state will beat us up if we have an ordinance that does that. I had the opportunity to do some preliminary looking about how that might apply here. The school itself creates a significant issue for us in terms of creating buffering, because it is directly adjacent to a lot of commercial along Highway 12, and then to the east of the school, a lot of industrial. So if we maxed out the school buffer of 1,000 feet, we'd wipe out a lot of the area of the community for some of these eligible business locations. So we have to be probably a little bit refined about how we think about buffering from the school. And for the public hearing, I'm working with the city engineer to create some ideas around that, and we'll have some mapping to show you about options we might have for that buffering. The school is probably the primary one. There's also a park up by Jackie B's. That would be an issue if they wanted to do some cannabis retailing out of their facility. And there's a park right in the middle of the block down here that would have some impact on some of the commercial sites along Highway 12 as well. So, like I said, we'll have to be a little bit refined about how we create these buffers. But we do have the opportunity to make sure that we're trying to protect the youth of the community from cannabis retailing and even cannabis general industrial business, frankly, the way the statute's written. But we'll have some time to think about that, and we'll plot out some ideas for you at the upcoming hearing for your discussion.
Why is it that you can have 500 feet for a daycare and 1,000 feet for school?
Right.
I think them little kids are just as involved with it as the bigger ones.
Yeah, I know it's easy, I think, to quibble with a lot of the rules in this statute in terms of why it would be written that way, or the why question is something I can't answer for you. The legislature decided this is the way it's going to be for us, so now we're stuck with what the law says. We have, like I said, we have a little discretion to move around in that envelope, but we can't do any more than that.
Do you have a discretion to decrease the footage?
We can decrease the footage, right? We can't increase it.
You can decrease.
We can decrease it, right? And I will say that one thing that some cities are doing, because they've run into this kind of a problem, is how we measure. So some of them have, rather than measure point to point on the property lines, might measure from the building entrance to the building entrance, or those kinds of ways. There are different ways to think about.
And that's what we're going to do.
And that's probably what we're going to end up doing here. So I think to try and create some buffer from those school zones, those daycares, but not get crossways with the legislative requirements.
Are there buffers for liquor stores?
That would be discretionary in the city. I'm not sure that, we'd have to look that up. But that's an excellent question, because I do know that some cities are trying to track the cannabis business buffer with their liquor store buffers, if
Right.
they've got one. So I appreciate that question. We'll
What
definitely
about tobacco?
check that. Tobacco, we do not have any buffer requirements. And I'll talk a little bit about tobacco more when we talk about hemp, because there's a little bit of the state treats them differently. Cannabis, full-on cannabis businesses versus what they call low-potency hemp, gummies and those kinds of things. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So we'll talk about, that probably relates a lot to the tobacco discussion, so. We have the ability to talk about hours of operation. The state says cannabis businesses cannot be open from 2 a.m. to 8 a.m. And then the city, if you wish, you can expand those closed hours more if you want. So some cities are tracking with common business hours in the community. Some of them are tracking with bar hours. Some of them aren't touching the hours of operation at all and just relying on the state's closure periods. But the statute gives you the ability to create some hours of operation if you wish to. Odor is another one that is the state talks about. There's some discussion in the industry about how you go about regulating odor. It's a hard one, because the one we think about most often is smoke. But the production aspect of cannabis manufacturing creates some odor of its own. So the problem is that we don't have a good way to objectively regulate odor. The Pollution Control Agency is apparently working on some of that language, and there may be some models in other states that might be applicable to us, so we're doing a little research into that. And I apologize for not having a little more kind of final information for you, because this has been a moving target. The Office of Cannabis Management just rolled out a lot of their stuff here within the last 30 or 60 days. So we don't have a whole lot of time, but so we're learning as we go. And so odor is one of the things that we may eventually address. Personally, I think that it's probably not something we would have in our initial ordinance, just because I don't think we have a good way of talking about how to enforce it, but that may change over time. I will also say that probably a lot of this might change over time, because the OCM they're kind of making it up on the fly a little bit too. And so once there's some more experience in the state with businesses of this type, we may see some changes coming from the state level as well. So just this is probably something we'll be dealing with over the next several months, on and off. So you asked about hemp, or tobacco is what you asked about, but what hemp is the other, that's the other side of this. Currently the city has been responsible, or the county have taken it upon themselves to license tobacco and hemp products generally. It's a local government decision currently. The state OCM will take over hemp business licensing. Again, primarily our role would be to determine where we want to allow low potency hemp products to be sold. Gummies, THC infused beverages, things like that. A lot of communities are tracking with the tobacco licensing for these types of products, since those facilities are already attuned to keeping things behind the counter, IDing customers, going through compliance checks. So it's not a new thing for them if they add hemp THC products to their line of business, if they haven't already. So tracking the tobacco licensing is typically how a lot of communities are doing that particular aspect. It will be interesting to see what happens to the hemp THC business industry when full-on cannabis becomes legal. So I think it's kind of akin to the 3-2 beer thing. How much hemp product might be sold if they can go down the block to find something more potent, if that's what they're after. So who knows? But for the time being, I think our expectation is to kind of stick with the county and the tobacco licensing as a practice for that, those types of products. The other one that is probably the most complex and the one that I probably have the least amount of good solid information for you is temporary cannabis events. The statute carves out a requirement that cities allow temporary cannabis events, and doesn't do a whole lot more about defining what that means. So there's a lot of room for local regulation. A temporary cannabis event is limited by statute to be no more than 4 days long, but the local governments can decide where they can go, whether or not they can sell product out of their booth. Think of a farmer's market for cannabis products, whether they're allowed to sell or just display. There are other aspects of hours of operation, those kinds of things. You can limit their locations to those places where you already allow retail sales. For instance, if once we apply our buffers, we could say events can only be held in legal retailing locations, or whatever. You have a lot of flexibility about how you want to think through that. But events are one of those things that I think everybody's kind of scratching their heads about. We don't really know what to expect yet, and I will tell you that in my experience, most cities are saying we're not going to allow use at an event, so there won't be smoking of cannabis products or consumption of other cannabis products at events, but there might be retail sales. So as long as they're in a retail location, let's say they want to set up an event over here across at the restaurant, and the restaurant wants to allow them to locate in their parking lot to have a cannabis event. They can retail from there, but most cities are saying we don't want use of products consumption on site, and that they have to be in a location where retail sales would otherwise be allowed. That's a very common track for the event aspect of things. And again, I wish I had better, clear guidance for you on these, but they're still being examined. And there are some cities who are concerned about how you manage consumption, especially when you're thinking about gummies or that kind of thing. Smoking is probably easier to identify if somebody's smoking cannabis product. They're going to be given away by the aroma, but THC edibles or even cannabis edibles, those kinds of things are going to be harder to detect. So, so there are some cities that are not really knowing how to deal with the consumption part of it yet, but for these event issues. But that's the overview, and there's a lot more detail, and I apologize for how much detail I've already dumped on you, because it's hard to track, and so I'm sympathetic with trying to follow this discussion on your part. Believe it or not, I'm a little sympathetic to the staffers at the state OCM too. Trying to come up with this stuff out of whole cloth is, I don't envy that job. But we have their material to work with, so that's what we're doing.
I have a question. It doesn't identify R1 residential at all in any of the documentation I've read.
No.
But people are able to grow cannabis on their property.
Right. Yeah, the current language in the law allows individuals to grow, I think it's 8 plants on their property and consume on their property.
But what if they decide to sell?
Then they are not permitted to sell. The only way anybody can sell cannabis product is through licensing through the state and then being properly zoned by the local government. If they're selling, then they're outside the law. They're subject to criminal enforcement at that point.
Okay, well, I just wanted to clarify that because you didn't mention R1 zoning at all,
No.
just I, and B2.
Yeah, the presumption here would be that we would be in business and industrial districts for the purposes of these businesses only, right?
Okay.
You bring up one point, though, that is another aspect that the city will eventually tackle as part of their regulation, and that is smoking in public. Right now, there's very little, if any, regulation of smoking in public. Some cities have adopted regulations now that prohibit tobacco smoking in public parks and on public property, and then carry that over to any other product like cannabis. So there is some, I think, interest that cities might have in saying no cannabis smoking in the park, but we're not going to regulate tobacco. But I think from a practical matter, most people have said that's a nuisance issue. That's the only way we can really regulate. So no tobacco, no cannabis, no anything, no smoking in the public park or on public property. That's something that we haven't done yet, but we'll need to address as part of the city's regulation. If you don't prohibit it, the law presumes it's legal. So we will need to take some action, assuming you want to prohibit smoking in public places.
What about the consent issue?
Consent?
Yeah, where the city can give consent to the county to really enforce or
Yes.
administer the program.
Right. That's the joint powers agreement that the county is promoting, and the city basically would turn over its administrative role to the county. So the county would be the one to respond to the state when the state says, we have a license application for such and such an address. It would be the county's responsibility to respond. But the county has said, as part of the joint powers, that they will then ask the city, is this an appropriately zoned location? Does the building meet your building code? And then we would say yay or nay to the county, assuming if it's a yay, then they would tell the state
But
that.
we're still vacillating in Montrose as to how it's going to be handled, or has the decision been made?
I apologize.
The agreement has not been executed and signed or approved by council. They have looked at it. We are going to be looking at it again in October. The city attorney is reviewing it right now, so.
I was just wondering.
Yeah,
if-
we are working on that. Some of the cities kind of got together to look at some of the language and just kind of see how we were going to handle it. But we are working on that. And we will be joining the joint power
Because
agreement.
it was vacillating back between city and joint powers agreement. and
Yeah, we
council.
will be joining.
Where are we going? with it?
Yep, we'll be putting this on the county.
The county has kind of strong-armed the cities in this way because since they provide law enforcement for Montrose and many cities around, they have said if you don't join our joint powers agreement, we're not going to do law enforcement on cannabis for you.
No.
So, because it's separate from our normal law enforcement contract, that's been their approach. So,
It is
the cities
strong-arming.
don't have a whole lot of flexibility in that area, so. And
Is there a cost to that, joining that? No.
no, the county has said they will take over the role. There's no charge to the city. However, there is a registration fee that the local government can charge the business, but the county will keep that fee. So, but then it will be the county's duty to do the administration and compliance checks and those kinds of things, so.
Well, if Montrose did join the joint powers agreement. Would that alleviate some of the administration burden?
Yeah, when the state asks the local government whether this is an appropriately zoned location, the county will be responsible for answering, but they'll place a call or send an email to Jessica or saying, here's the location, is this properly zoned? And Jessica will say, yay or nay, and then they'll go back to the county's burden to do whatever other checking and
So it
compliance
does
check
have
after
its
that.
advantages.
Yeah, it should reduce administrative burden. It does not reduce our need to adopt an ordinance, though, because the county will ask us what our ordinance says about these places. Is it, what are the hours of operation you want to impose? Is this located too close to a school or a daycare or whatever for your sensibilities? So,
That wasn't my concern, because my concern was after the ordinance was in place, how it was going to be administered.
yeah, presumably the city will have very little administrative responsibility after the fact then, at that point.
Okay.
So what are you mainly looking
complicated.
for from the planning and zoning committee? Like answers on each specific question kind of
If
thing?
you've got answers tonight, I'll take them. I wanted to basically roll it out to you tonight and kind of give you an overview of what we're looking at. And I'm happy for you to either tell me what your impressions are right away, but if you want to spend some time thinking about it, we can certainly do that at the public hearing in October too. So it's whatever you're comfortable with, but it's a lot of stuff, so I don't expect you necessarily to have preformed.
It sort of sounds to me like it would make a lot of sense on some of these, like with the hemp stuff, just to go along with what the tobacco rules are, with retail stuff to have it be similar to alcohol. Manufacturing, I mean, wouldn't we kind of go along with the any other manufacturing ordinances that we have? I mean,
That would be,
Doesn't it seem like
that'd be the
that
way
would be
most cities are doing it.
do it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and we can kind of absorb this, and I'd like to get, well, at the public hearing, public input too, to see
Okay.
what
There's gonna be a public hearing.
citizens, next
Yeah,
month,
okay.
so
Yeah, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
start making decisions after that.
Yeah, okay.
But yeah, it is a lot to take in. I read through it like 3 times, and I'm still,
No, it-
Yeah, we wanted to give
If it isn't
everybody
enough, I will
time.
promise you.
We wanted
I'm
to give
still-
everybody the information and some time to look over, and if you want to do some research or think about it over the next month before our public hearing and bring some ideas.
And you'll have more information in a month.
We'll have more information. I'll certainly have some mapping for you to look at about our separation buffers and how they might play out. So, and anything else here that you can think of. If you're reading through it,
Are you able to research if there's any evidence whatsoever that buffers do any good?
that would be a separate research in terms of the effectiveness of buffers.
Right.
Well, I can
make
see
people
if
feel
there's
good.
some information out there. I think that's an excellent question, so.
Okay.
Well, it is complex. I went to a flower shop, not anywhere near us.
What's that?
I went to a floral shop or a garden center, and they were selling gummies.
you know, agricultural.
And I don't know what kind of a license they had, but my son said they've been selling them for a long time, so.
There are a lot of aspects of this. Some of them don't affect us. But rural communities, there's a statutory, it might even be a constitutional right that agriculture growers can sell out of the stands, sell their products out of a stand. And so there's a little bit of a battle going on right now as to whether somebody who's grown in the rural area can pop a stand out at the corner. So there are a lot of fingers to this, and some of them, fortunately, we don't have to tackle ourselves, but.
I would expect that. I mean, I'll toss in a couple of my observations. I think what's been happening in the tax area, because I assume that's the principal driver that from the state is tax revenue.
Right.
Yeah, that's why it was passed.
So are we seeing that? Are we getting visibility as far as how they approach that?
The tax generation is pretty well spelled out in the statute. OCM has got to do some rulemaking work around that, but there is some tax sharing
Okay.
between.
Because the reason I was asking the question is, are they following the track of kind of tax on alcohol kind of track, or tax on tobacco kind of thing? Or they license the pack? I mean, there's all that kind of thing that I think they would give us a general, gist. The second thing is, I would like to see whatever we come up with to make sure that it doesn't add a burden to the deputies, right? I can imagine a nightmare of having a fragmented legal system, and they're trying to keep track of, this is unique or different on this, but not to that, whatever. That would be a nightmare from a law enforcement standpoint. And so their job is tough enough as it is. So if we can try to be consistent, so the sheriffs with the county don't have additional burden, that'd be important. The third thing is that a lot of the distances as far as setback and that kind of thing, I was struggling to try to understand how you're actually measuring those distances. What happens if there's a fence between, even though there's a school and a fence and a commercial area? So are we measuring it as transit distances? In other words, if you walk from the front door to the front door or whatever, is that what we're meaning by these distances, or is it, line of sight distance?
That's one of the things we'll actually have to define
Okay.
as part of our,
That's an area.
how we measure, right?
So I would argue that, it would only make sense that, how is that done elsewhere within the county, right? We need to be consistent, right? Again, back to the poor law officer that's trying to enforce this.
How did you measure my distance from the cement factory, my residence?
What do you mean, how did we?
You said when we were discussing the cement factory that my house was 880 feet from where the cement factory was going. I was just wondering how you
That was
came.
zoned industrial, right? The area they're doing that, is
Yeah.
that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, never mind.
Are you more than, okay.
So, and I guess my final comment, I know it's just a nit, but on the last page, we're speaking about low potency and where things shall be stored behind the counter. And it's a little confusing. It seems to read, and I think this is language that's proposed out of the state, right?
Not necessarily.
Okay. So to me, I was confused. They're saying it behind the counter and in a locked case? Or can it be anywhere in a locked case? Doesn't have to be behind the counter? I mean, that seems to be a little bit of ambiguity.
Okay, I see what your question is, okay.
I think it's either or. From what I've
Right,
seen.
I mean, I wrote in or, but I mean, from a law enforcement standpoint, I think that would be a nightmare from a officer, on the, dynamic situation to say, well, it's not locked behind the counter or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's confusing. So it seems to be, the language is a little bit confusing. Anyway.
My answer would be right now is that I think what we want to do is track tobacco on these potency things. So we'll do some follow-up on that approach too. So just, I think in line with your suggestion to make it easy on the deputies. Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Look forward to that next month.
Mr. Chair, I will say, if you're working on this, if you're reading through it or you're doing some research and you have some questions or something you want us to research or have some ideas, you don't have to wait till the public hearing. Send a note to Jessica, she'll pass it on, or directly to me is fine too. because the more we can make sure we've got information for you available, the better off. So, like I said, if you come up with some things you want to share or ask about or whatever, please feel free to send them along at any time.
Well, I have a question about the R1 businesses. We advocate for businesses in the R1 residential areas, different types of businesses. I mean, we've changed our ordinances to accommodate them. Will this be the case also eventually with cannabis sales?
Well, I think you're probably referring to some home occupation ability, but most of our home occupations don't allow direct over-the-counter retail sale out of a home occupation. There's some exclusions to that, but the assumption here is that a retail business is going to be located in a retail business zone only, not in an R1 district. So I don't think there's any.
Because that would be a nightmare for our residential areas. Any residential area.
Yeah, no intention to allow licensing in residential areas here.
And the state is going to issue the licensing.
The state is the licensing authority, yeah, right. They just check with us to make sure the location
Okay.
meets our code.
Anything else? Okay, our next meeting will be on Wednesday, October 9th, here at the community center at 7 p.m. Before adjournment, I would like to take a moment of silence, recognize those people that 23 years ago lost their lives in the state. Thank you, and I'd look for a motion to adjourn.
Okay, do we need anything as far as the sit-in up to have an open session? Do you need any motions that we do that?
No, it was already
Something's
set
already
that,
said here.
Okay, so it's already captured. All right, great.
Yeah.
And I move that we adjourn.
all right, second.
Second
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Oh, good.
Adjourn the meeting at 7:51.
Sam,
Take a look at it.
I noticed that the state flag.
Welcome aboard.
Why is that? What was? Well, I'll ask Jen.